Good morning, and very good morning. Welcome to the show. Welcome to VUEGRAPHY. Hope you guys doing great. Okay, so I got a question from a friend of mine, fellow photographer from Lahore, Pakistan, named Hashim Bhai. I call him Hashim Bhai. His name is Hashim Malik. So basically, he's a very fine gentleman, and he's using different formats of cameras and gears from different brands. So he's a neutral person, very neutral. So he uses Fujifilm, Canon, Sony, Nikon. He uses everything. He got a very good collection of lenses. He basically sent me a question that he is using Panasonic G9. So Panasonic is basically a company which makes micro four thirds system, which is smaller than APS-C crop sensor. So he sent me a question. He said that I'm getting micro blur in my G9, and I was like, obviously you will get micro blur because it's 80 megapixel, so he 80 megapixel equivalent. And he was like, well, G9 is 20 megapixel. I was like, yeah, that's true. On paper, G9 from Panasonic, it's 20 megapixel. But when you scale up and make it equal to full frame, it's basically 80 megapixel. What that it means? Well, before I jump and explain you all this, let me share with you a couple of things which makes you more clear what I'm going to say next. First of all, you have to understand the factor, understand the thing called crop factor. What is crop factor? Crop factor is like, this is the full frame, all right, full frame sensor, which is like 36 millimeter by 24 millimeter. Okay, so if you narrow it down by 1.4 times, you will get crop sensor, which is like 24 millimeter by 16 millimeter over here. All right, and so that's 1.5 times smaller. So if you scale up by 1.5 times this 24 by 16, you will end up having 36 by 24 full frame. Clear? Now if you scale down this full frame 36 by 24 millimeter by 2 times, like twice, both by the width and by the height. So 36 half is like 18 and 24 half is like 12. So 18 by 12, that's micro four thirds sensor. So it's like you stack these 4 micro four thirds sensors twice in the width and twice in the height. So you end up having a full frame physically, right? I hope that's clear as per the illustration I'm trying to show you guys. So if you have a full frame and you reduce both the width and the height of the sensor by 1.5 times, you will end up having crop sensor. If it's 1.6, it's Canon crop sensor. And if you reduce the size, width and the height of the full frame by 2 times, you end ending up having this this micro four thirds sensor. Clear? I hope it's clear. Now imagine you have this micro four thirds sensor, which is supposed to be G9, which is 20 megapixel. So you take these one sensor and stack into 4 full frame, because it ending up consuming 4 in volume. You are going to have 80 megapixel in equivalent full frame. Clear? I hope it's clear. So that's how we calculate. Like if you want, it's very simple. In order to calculate, let me give you a quick mathematical formula. I hope it will help you. The crop sensor, all right, which is like APS-C, has a multiplication factor of 1.5. So width and height, you multiply the width of 1.5, crop factor multiply by 1.5, that's 2.25. So if you want to see any crop sensor camera which has X number of megapixel, let's say 24 megapixel crop sensor, you multiply that 24 by 2.25 to get the equivalent full frame number of pixels. So if you have 24 megapixel crop sensor, multiply by 2.25, you will end up having 54 megapixel full frame. So it means that If you have 54 megapixel full frame and you are having 24 megapixel crop sensor, they are equivalent. They are equal in terms of giving you the resolution, the same resolution. Okay, now come to the micro four thirds system. Micro four thirds system twice and twice. So it's by 2 into 2, 4. So if you have 20 megapixel, micro four thirds system multiply by 4, that gives you 80 megapixel full frame equivalent resolution. So if you have 80 megapixel full frame and you have crop sensor 20 megapixel, you get the shot of the same scene, you zoom to 100%, you will get equivalent amount of details. That's how it goes. I hope I made this clear. So once you have this clear, now let's talk about micro blur. What is micro blur? Micro blur is basically that slight micro blur, like really slight blur, which gives you that hint that the image is not sharp. Obviously, the image is not going to be sharp. Why? Because when you press the shutter release button, regardless how stable you are, regardless how good the IBIS is, you still not going to get sharp images because camera shakes. Even when the shutter blades open, it shakes the camera. So why we are having micro blur? Why we haven't noticed that thing back in the days when we have less megapixel? Why it's having more abundantly more visible each passing day when we are having a higher megapixel camera? Well, it is, the reality is that micro blur is always there. It's always there, even with 12 megapixel full frame. It's there, but it's never visible because it's how can I say this? 12 megapixel is basically a less resolution to make it visible. When you go 100% on 12 megapixel, you won't be able to get that much closer to the zoom because the pixel size is bigger. So basically 12 megapixel is 8.4 micrometer, this big pixel, all right, and compared to 61 megapixel that was Sony A7 R4, which is 61 megapixel. Its pixel size is 3.7 something micrometer. So 8.4 of D700 or D3 has or Sony A7 S series. 12 megapixel has 8.4 micrometer, whereas 3.7 something, 3.8 micrometers, a big difference. So when you go 100%, so what software in Lightroom or Photoshop, what it does, it goes to the pixel level zoom. So if this is a pixel this big, it goes up to the zoom of this. But if you are having a smaller pixel, it goes zoom up to that pixel, which makes you visible everything. So the bottom line is, the higher the resolution, the more closer you are able to see and close to the image, to the pixel. Okay, so micro blur is always there even with 12 megapixel, but due to the low resolution you will not able to see that close. That's why you never observed micro blur. But the more resolution you are going to increase, the more high resolution that you are going to have, on regardless if it's full frame, if it's crop sensor, or if it's micro four thirds system, it doesn't matter. We are talking specifically the resolution per square millimeter. All right, so the more number of pixels per unit area you're going to have, the more micro blur you are going to see. So that's the whole summary. In 12 megapixel full frame, the number of pixels per unit area is very less because the size of the pixel is very big. That's one of the reasons. So you start having more megapixel, like let's talk about full frame. Okay, let's talk about full frame only. 12 megapixel, then 24 megapixel, 36 megapixel, 45 megapixel, 61 megapixel. That's how it goes. So the pixel pitch is moving from 8.4 and all the way to this all the way, which was in 24 megapixel is somewhere 6.4 6 micron, and then 36 is 5.6 something, 5.4 something, and then 45 is 4 point something micron meter, and 61 is 3.8 or 3.7 micron meter. So the higher the number of pixels, the smaller the size of the pixel. The more pixels you are going to have per unit area, the smaller the pixel size is going to be. Okay, so the more pixels you are going to have, the more visible the micro blur is going to be. All right, so same goes for this APS-C. APS-C as sensor used to have 12 megapixel, which was equal to, actually it used to have 10 megapixel. I still have D200, 10 megapixel, which is equal to 24 megapixel full frame, again multiply by 2.25. Then that 12 megapixel, which multiply by 2.25, I think it's somewhere around, I don't know, let's see. And then we have 16 megapixel, which is equivalent to 36 megapixel full frame. All right, and that's where the micro blur starts observing. The very first micro blur was start observing with Nikon release 36 megapixel D800 series. Okay, I'll tell you why it was visible in the D800 series onwards, all the high resolution cameras. So even that is still there, even in the crop sensor it was there. 10 megapixel, 12 megapixel, 16 megapixel and 24 megapixel. All right, now we reach to 33 and up to 40 megapixel right now in this APS-C lineup. 40 megapixel, the newly announced Fujifilm XH2, that's 40 megapixel. So which is equivalent to multiply by 1.55 is equal to 80 megapixel something, which is highest, very high, very high. Then 40, yeah. So next, and then we have micro four third system, which is again 12, I believe 10, 10, 12, 16, all the way 20 megapixel and more. So which is again gives you around 80 megapixel full frame equivalent resolution. So it's not about the number of pixels, it's about the number of pixels per unit area. In order to understand the per unit area, you have to understand the crop factor, so which I explained in the beginning of this video. All right, so crop factor is explained, you understood what how it works. So how to avoid micro blur? Well, you can't. That's the unfortunate reality. You can't avoid micro blur. Micro blur start observing when you are going to move from 33 megapixel onwards. You start seeing micro blur. Up to 24 megapixel, you are in a safe zone. You are not able to observe micro blur much into the images. But as the moment you cross 33 megapixel, that's my observation, like 36 megapixel, 40 megapixel, 45, 50, 61, 100. That's where micro blur is inevitable. It's there. It's going to be there. Even it was there in 12 megapixel, but it was not visible because of less resolution. The more resolution you are going to see, the more visible micro blur is going to be, which is starting 33 megapixel. So in 40 megapixel, 45 megapixel full frame, you are obviously going to see. When I first used D850, I remember I was very happy that D850 is still the best DSLR in the world, period. When I was having D850, within 1 week after using it, within 1 week, I realized that this machine is not easy. It cannot be operated the way I used to operate D700, which was 12 megapixel. Now 12 megapixel and 45 megapixels is like 4 times the number of pixels, 4 times. So it means that if I'm having a blur, micro blur in 12 megapixel, I hope you can see this illustration. In this micro 12 megapixel, if I am having a micro blur which basically affecting 4 pixels over here, if I move or if I experience the same type of micro blur on D850, it affecting 4 times of it, like 16 megapixels. instead of 4 over here, it's affecting 16. That's why in D850 I was having micro blur all the time, because it was keep showing it was too many megapixels to capture that micro blur or to be affected by micro blur. Same goes for diffraction. If you are having a diffraction, if you are shooting at f22, you are going to see more soft images in high resolution cameras, unlike the low resolution camera. If you are using 12 megapixel full frame, diffraction is going to be less affecting on low resolution 12 megapixel, but you will see more softer images on high resolution camera if you are shooting at f16 and above. Same goes for micro blur. Okay, so when I was using D850 and I observed that I cannot operate D850 like my D700 12 megapixel. I can't. So I basically developed a step how to operate efficiently D850 because of high resolution. And what those steps are, first of all, I have to use tripod regardless. I have to use tripod. I have to use mirror lockup because it was DSLR. I have to use exposure delay mode. Exposure delay mode is basically you click and then camera waits for a certain amount of time and then it opens up the shutter for the exposure. So what happened, and when the camera waits for up to the timer, which up maximum up to 3 seconds. So once you click, camera waits for 3 seconds and then it open up the shutter to expose. So what it happens in that 3-second time, the camera settle down all that vibration and then it's going to take a micro blur free shot. That's what happened. You can vary the timer, exposure delay timer from 0.2 seconds, 0.5 seconds, 1 second, 2 seconds up to 3 seconds. So I always use 3 seconds, that's exposure delay mode. I did the same when I was using Z7 because it was there. Even I do the same. I did the same for my with my this medium format because it's a bigger sensor, carries so many pixels, and so micro exposure delay mode was a must. So and then exposure, so the tripod, mirror lockup, exposure delay, and the remote trigger. So imagine if you don't have the remote trigger. The D850 has touch screen trigger, so I use that touch screen. Rather than I push the shutter release button, I use the back camera LCD as a touch screen to trigger the shutter. So I used to do that in order to have a micro blur free images. Now I had an argument with at one of the Facebook group, and where somebody asked me that I bought the D850, I want to operate, give me the way, tell me how to operate. So I enlist all these features which I just explained, and people made fun of me over there. They said, how come you are saying this? It means that we cannot shoot bird photography, action photography, wildlife photography if we follow your procedure. And I was like, man, these people really have no idea, or they are not using their brain. If you are shooting bird, wildlife or action photography, you are not shooting at low shutter speed. You are shooting always at 1000 or 2000 shutter speed. That's where the micro blur never exists, because you are always shooting at high shutter speed. In order to avoid micro blur, you have to shoot at high shutter speed if you are not following these steps which I just explained moments ago. But again, argument for the sake of the argument. Anyway, so these were the steps. If you are using mirrorless high resolution camera like A7R4 or Z7, Z7, Z9, Z7, Z7 II, Z9, Sony A7R4 or R3 or Canon R5. If you are using all these cameras, so obviously you can use tripod, exposure delay mode, or touch screen to trigger it, because there is no lockup there. So you can do that. See, so micro blur, it's there, it's going to be there. You can't avoid it. You can minimize it. All right. What I used to do when I was having a high resolution camera, I used to take multiple shots of the same, tuck, 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 tuck. That's because if I'm not able to get and I try to take the image back to back, because when I click, it shakes the camera, it settles down on the tripod and everything. So if I click again, the camera already have the same shake before, and it's settled down all the way through the tripod to the ground. So I was having this experience that it is less likely I'm going to have a micro blur if I'm shooting back to back. So my hit ratio always ends up 50% having a micro blur free images if I'm shooting back to back. But if I'm taking my time, composer thought, my hit ratio was less, because again micro blur was always there. So you can't avoid micro blur. You just can't. There is no way. Sorry. Period. So I hope I made the point very clear that how to avoid micro blur. What is micro blur? Micro blur happening because camera shakes when you press the shutter release button. Even if the camera is on tripod, it shakes. All right, and you can't avoid it until unless you use the shutter release cable or the app from the mobile to trigger it. Then, then is another case. Then is another case. You can avoid micro blur using a remote triggering through the mobile or through the cable. But if you are going to use the shutter release button, it means that you're physically basically shaking the camera, which always be there. So there is no other way. There is no other way to avoid micro blur. I remember DA50 was a real pain in the neck because I was constantly carrying micro blur. So I knew that that's not my daily use camera. I just can't use it on daily basis. So that's where I still prefer to shoot my daily shoots, my daily normal images by D700 or D3S, which I still shooting with. I still shoot with D3S, and because 12 megapixel, it saves me so much from so many headaches, which I will make videos some other time. Advantage and disadvantage of shooting low resolution versus high resolution. That's a good point. Let me write it down in my notes that I have to make a video about that. Wait, I'll write it later. Anyways, so I hope you like this video, and I hope Pashambai you got my point in this video, which I told you that I will make the video of a video about it. So, and I hope I will be able to make a good animation in order to explain you this thing about the crop crop sensor that uh, crop sensor versus this micro four third, the crop factor. Yeah. So crop factor is really important to understand in order to understand the number of pixels per unit area. People think that we are having full frame, so that's best for low light. No, 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 for not anymore, not anymore. People still talk and think that if you are having full frame camera, you are a pro photographer. You're better for you are going to have a good low light. No, it has nothing to do with low light performance. Having a full frame, not anymore in today's world. It's more about the pixel size. It's all about how many pixels you are squeezing in per unit area, which is the maximum in micro four thirds system. That's why they are very bad in low light. Followed by crop sensor, full frame. It's always there. I prefer not to shoot at with high resolution camera. Maximum you can go up to 1600 ISO. But if you are having crop sensor, oh sorry, less resolution camera, you can shoot easily. I shoot with 8000, 10,000 ISO like this without any issue. 6400 ISO I shoot with D3S without any issue. because I know 12 megapixel, big, 8.4 micron meter. I can these cameras having so much big pixel that they can capture anything, even in lowest of light. So that's it. I'm going to wrap up this video now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in future with some new content. Till then, take care. Bye.